took a class in college called U.S. History Since 1945. And you would think that a major anti-war demonstration that resulted in violent clashes with police and a 5-month-long, highly publicized trial might come up at some point in a class that's effectively only covering half a century, and yet, even after taking that class, before seeing this movie, I had never heard of Tom Hayden, Abbie Hoffman, Bobby Seale, or the Chicago 7. In defense of the nice elderly priest at Notre Dame who taught that class, it may have been covered and I just forgot about it. But in my defense, Aaron Sorkin claims that he also had never heard of the trial when Steven Spielberg first broached the idea of making a movie out of it. He says he walked out of Spielberg's house after agreeing to write the movie and then immediately called his dad to ask what the Chicago 7 was. The trial of the Chicago 7 tells the story of the trial of the Chicago 7. If you're like me 10 months ago and that term means nothing to you, that was the name given to the group of defendants who were put on trial for allegedly inciting a riot at the anti-Vietnam War protests held outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in the summer of 1968. The eponymous 7 are Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, David Dellinger, John Froines, and Lee Weiner, plus an 8th defendant, Bobby Seale, whose inclusion in the trial was controversial from the start, and it only got worse from there. I try to include a small bit of plot summary in these every year, just so I can set up the movie enough to talk about it. And it wasn't until I started writing this section that I really began to appreciate how many players there are in this story and how much there really is to set up. And the movie introduces all these characters and effectively establishes their personalities and gives you a pretty damn good idea of what's coming for each of them in like the 3 minutes before the title card drops. I guess my point is this movie does a lot of things really well, and maybe it's easy to overlook how well it's doing them. For the sake of time and clarity, I'll be a little reductive. Only 5 of the 7 get any meaningful amount of screen time, and only 2 of the 7 are ever really center stage in the narrative. Tom Hayden, played by Eddie Redmayne, and Abbie Hoffman, played by Sacha Baron Cohen. Jeremy Strong plays Jerry Rubin, and he gets a few nice moments, but he's mostly just Abbie Hoffman light. And Alex Sharp plays Rennie Davis, but he is really just Tom Hayden light. John Carroll Lynch plays David Dellinger, who I mention not because he's particularly important to the movie, but just because I love John Carroll Lynch and will take any opportunity to shout him out. Mark Rylance plays lead defense attorney William Kunstler, and he's low-key really good in this. Joseph Gordon-Levitt plays the lead prosecutor, and he's not really given a ton to do, but he's good. And then Frank Langella plays the awful judge, whose behavior I would cite as comically antagonistic to the point of disbelief, if it wasn't taken mostly from the trial transcripts. But honestly, the star of the show, for however much he's in the show, is Yahya Abdul-Mateen as Bobby Seale, the controversial 8th defendant. It's helpful to know that these defendants were carefully selected, and depending on who you ask, they were arguably selected more so based on their affiliations with various left-wing groups than what they might have done to incite the riots at the DNC. Tom Hayden was the leader of Students for Democratic Society, Abbie Hoffman was a co-founder of the Youth International Party, and Bobby Seale was a co-founder of the Black Panther Party. As argued in the movie, and by many in real life, Seale's inclusion in the trial was indicative of how much these proceedings were driven by politics more than the law. That this was Richard Nixon's infamous Justice Department making an example out of these anti-Vietnam War protesters. Bobby Seale's constant refrain throughout the movie is that he was only in Chicago for 4 hours total during the demonstrations, and yet he was somehow being charged with conspiracy with some people who he hadn't even met until the indictments. He claimed, and I buy, that he was only included in the case so that there could be a scary black man at the defense table, and the government thought those optics could help their case. I'm assuming anyone who's already familiar with this trial is already aware of this, but the judge's treatment of Bobby Seale in the courtroom is alarming, to say the absolute least. Of all the real-life events in this movie that probably should have been covered in my schooling at some point, the treatment of Bobby Seale in the courtroom is the thing that I'm most upset that I had to learn about in an Aaron Sorkin movie. The movie plays out as 3 narrative threads woven together: the trial itself, flashbacks to the events leading up to the riot, and a philosophical and dispositional tension between Tom Hayden and Abbie Hoffman. And all 3 narrative threads are very interesting. You might expect the trial itself to be little more than a framing device to tell the real story. That's kind of what trials are, just a recounting of events. But plenty of story actually takes place at the trial itself, largely due to the judge's antagonism and the courtroom antics of Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. I'm admittedly a total mark for Sorkin's writing, but Even so, structuring the movie this way, with 3 narrative threads on parallel tracks, really worked for me. Particularly the way the stories play off each other, and particularly the way they all reach their dramatic climaxes simultaneously. The key moment in the trial happens just as key revelations about the riot are made, just as the Abby-Tom conflict comes to a head. It's really well done. And all the other aspects of the screenplay mostly work for me. All the good usual Sorkin stuff, fast-paced musical dialogue, smart and funny quips, stirring emotional speeches, all that jazz.
We're going to Chicago peacefully, but if we're met there with violence, you better believe that we're going to meet that violence with
non-violence. Always non-violence, and that's without exception.
And there's also good setup and payoff. The star witness for the defense, whose casting I won't spoil, except to say that it's not Matt Damon, he's mentioned very early on and fairly inconspicuously. They hang just enough of a lantern on it that you internalize it, but not so much that you see him coming later. That really works for me. And adapting a true story, creative liberties need to be taken. Some real-life events are moved around, some are tweaked slightly, and some are invented whole cloth. Presumably, any deviation from real events is always in order to make things more dramatic. Sorkin did the same thing in The Social Network, in Steve Jobs, and in Molly's Game. Those movies also played with the timeline as needed in order to save the most dramatic events and reveals for maximum effect. All of that is a credit to Sorkin's writing, but it's also a credit to the Oscar-nominated editing by Alan Baumgarten. Sorkin's scripts are always well served by good editing. His bread and butter is cross-cutting between events being recounted, like a trial or deposition, and depicting the actual events. Abby Hoffman apparently did this speaking tour / stand-up comedy things on the weekends during the trial, where he would regale college students with stories of his exploits. And Sorkin was very smart to include that in the movie, for 2 reasons. Number 1, if you got Sacha Baron Cohen in your movie, use him as much as you can. And number 2, it effectively gives Sorkin and Alan Baumgarten an additional narrator to cross-cut with. So instead of just cross-cutting between trial testimony and the riot, they're able to cross-cut between a police officer's perspective on the riot as told from the witness stand, Abby Hoffman's very different perspective on the riot as told from a stage, and the riot itself. Best Picture contenders pretty much always get editing nominations. The real contenders, not the happy to be here Best Picture nominees. And Trial of the Chicago 7 is a legitimate Best Picture contender, but this isn't a perfunctory editing nomination. File this under things the movie does really well, but it's easy to overlook how well it's doing them. Not only is it balancing a lot of characters and maintains clarity, not only is it balancing different storylines and maintains drama, not for nothing, it's also a brisk, dynamic, well-paced movie, like we've come to expect from Sorkin. Sorkin was nominated for Best Director at the Golden Globes, at the Critics' Choice Awards, and notably at the Directors Guild Awards, but he missed the cut in Best Director at the Oscars. The nomination, presumably earmarked for him, instead went to surprise nominee Thomas Vinterberg for the Danish movie Another Round. I'm not at all going to complain about that. Another Round is awesome and more people should see it, and listen to my podcast episode about it. And I'm also not going to try to argue that Sorkin's directing is as strong as his writing, but he is a very good director, and I don't think he gets enough credit for that. I sort of alluded earlier that this was originally going to be directed by Steven Spielberg, but it never went into production because of the writer's strike 13 years ago. A few years later, it was going to be made by Paul Greengrass, but apparently he and the studio couldn't agree on a budget. I can only assume Greengrass had a specific vision of how to shoot the riots, particularly given his filmography, but the studio wasn't willing to pay for it. Which is odd, because Sorkin's version of the movie also shows the riots, so at first I assumed that Paramount must have relented in recent years and coughed up the money. Turns out, they didn't. Sorkin was interviewed by David Fincher for the Directors Guild podcast, and he joked that had he known he would have to direct this script as he was writing it, he wouldn't have included the riot scenes, because they're expensive. As he was writing the movie, he assumed they would be someone else's problem to figure out. So, given that they didn't have a Paul Greengrass budget, Sorkin and cinematographer Faden Papamichael had to get creative. They use a lot of tight close-ups, a lot of quick cuts, and a lot of smoke and tear gas to hide the small scale of the riot. And they integrate archival footage to make the scale seem a lot bigger. And it works, which is why I had no idea the budget was so low and why Paul Greengrass would have turned this down. Something the movie does well, easy to overlook, etc. I'm repeating myself. I'm sure you're seeing the pattern. The movie is really good across the board and is very skillfully made, but I don't know, maybe it's a less than the sum of its parts thing. I like everything it's doing, but no one thing really jumps out at me to really make me love the movie. I think the most interesting aspect of the movie is also the thing I find most frustrating about it, and that is its politics. And there are surface level politics and more nuanced politics. The surface level politics are just a simplistic Vietnam War bad, police brutality bad, Richard Nixon bad, etc. And in the context of a political movie, I just kind of find these things to be pretty boring, just because they're so obvious. The movie makes it extremely clear that we're supposed to be on the side of the Chicago 7 and leaves no room for doubt about that. The opening images are of draft letters being stuffed into mailboxes and archival footage of President Johnson announcing troop surges in Vietnam. Maybe 40 years ago, some audiences would be able to find some moral nuance in this, but in 2020, I think we can all agree that the draft was bad, and that more troops in Vietnam is bad, and the people we see planning to protest these things are supposed to be our good guys. And if you somehow still weren't convinced, the first post-title card scene is a conversation between young, idealistic prosecutor Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Richard Nixon's crotchety attorney general, which makes it abundantly clear that these indictments are punitive, reactionary, and possibly even legally dubious. Again, not much room for nuance in the surface level politics of the movie. But if you dig just a hair deeper, there are some slightly more nuanced political ideas in the conflict between Abby Hoffman and Tom Hayden. Hayden is portrayed as a straight-laced, jacket and tie establishment liberal, and Hoffman is more of a in-your-face, attention-seeking, prankster hippie leftist. Really brilliant casting, by the way, of both Redmayne and Baron Cohen. Basically, Hayden and Hoffman have the same goals for the most part, but super different ideas of how to best achieve those goals, and much different styles, demeanors, and philosophies. I'm not saying it's particularly complicated, but at least there's some nuance there. Personally, I think this dynamic between them is one of the strongest elements of the movie. There's just not much of it. It's set up in the first 20 minutes or so, and then both Hoffman and Hayden are mostly set aside until the movie's climax, especially Hayden. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the movie's content became newly relevant again in light of recent events. Apparently the reason they decided to finally make this movie now, after the script had been floating around for more than a decade, is because of then candidate and eventual President Donald Trump's rhetoric encouraging violence against protesters. And then last summer, hundreds of large-scale protests materialized across the country and the world in response to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, among others. And I saw cell phone footage and news footage and dash cam footage of protesters clashing with police. And a lot of the disturbing stuff you see in this movie, we all saw on the news for several months last year. But for a movie that's so police brutality adjacent, for a movie whose events are entirely centered on the conflict between people exercising their First Amendment rights and police trying to maintain order, violently if necessary, it's almost completely uninterested in exploring police brutality in any meaningful way, beyond just depicting it as something that has happened and is bad. And I know it's not fair of me to review this as the movie I wish it was, instead of as the movie it is, but it's hard not to. Not the movie's fault, but its proximity to real-life events actually makes it less interesting, not more interesting. After the summer of 2020, the movie's politics kind of feel tame. Which is wild to say because this movie is about 1968. The politics should not feel tame. I'm sounding more negative than I want to sound. Despite my aforementioned reservations, I really enjoyed this movie. I've watched it 3 times. But truth be told, this is the very rare type of movie that I really enjoy, but am also rooting against at the Oscars. Of the Best Picture nominees, this is one of maybe 3 that has a realistic shot of winning. And yet, of the 7 nominees I've seen as of this writing, it's probably number 6 or 7 for me. But I want to be clear, that says far more about the quality of these nominees than it does about Trial of the Chicago 7. I've seen the majority of the Best Picture nominees for the last decade plus, and this is far and away the best, least favorite nominee in a given year, if that makes sense. Regardless, if I'm personally keeping the movie a bit at arm's length because of its award season prospects, that's certainly a me problem. It's not even really an Oscars problem, and it's certainly not a Trial of the Chicago 7 problem.